The window was closing on the extent of the earthly ministry of Christ. Certainly the disciples, as they traveled with him toward Judea, had little idea of exactly what was soon to come. But they sensed that it involved certainly a lot of great difficulties ahead. They were traveling to a place where their master, their leader, their discipler, their teacher was hated and reviled by the religious leadership of their own people. Conflict and change and uncertainty held thick in the air. And along the way, a young man came up to Jesus and said to him, "Teacher, what good thing must I do to get eternal life?" And Jesus spoke to him of the issue of keeping the commandments, and what do they teach, and so on. And in exchange back and forth, the young man was able to affirm that from his childhood he had done well and had kept those commandments and requirements and so forth. But in the conversation, Jesus ups the price a bit and says that there's one thing lacking, that if he would want to be perfect, to sell his possessions and give to the poor, he says, and you will have treasure in heaven. And then come and follow me. When the young man heard this, it says in the scriptures, he went away sad because he had great wealth. And Jesus said to his disciples, "Truly I tell you, it is hard for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of heaven. Again, I tell you, it is easier for a camel, the largest thing you can imagine, to go through the eye of a needle, the smallest hole that you can imagine. It's easier for that than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of God." And I think there was kind of a bit of a quiet pause at that moment. Some of the disciples surely noted the moisture in the eyes of Christ as he reflected on this young man who was unwilling to give up earthly temporal gain for eternal and spiritual riches and treasures. And after what I presume must have been something of an awkward silence, the silent breaking disciple, the one who had surely loud and impertinent ancestors from the state of New Jersey, involuntarily found himself once again verbally upchucking his logical thought process. And on some of the hard days that Peter had been experiencing of trudging around the Judean and Galilean countryside, he found that there were times when he himself would reminisce back to the breezes and the water and the spray of his boat upon the Sea of Galilee and his love of the challenging business and the fishing industry. And practically without thinking, he broke that silence and said out loud, "We have left everything to follow you. What then will be for us?" Jesus said that everyone who has left houses, or brothers, or sisters, or family, or father, or mother, or wife, or children, or fields for my sake will receive 100 times as much and will inherit eternal life. But many who are first will be last, and many who are the last will be first. He basically says to Peter, "Peter, you can trust me on this. It might look like right now that following me around this dusty countryside, that you're at the back of the line. But lots of faithful people who feel that way are going to be, in the end, finding themselves at the front of the line and the other way around." Now that statement is going to come back at the end of the passage that we look at today in Matthew chapter 20, serving as a sort of bookends of the truths that we want to examine this morning. Our title today is to speak of the economy of grace. The economy of grace. We think a lot about the economy. We hear about it in the news all of the time. As we go to the 20th chapter of Matthew for the parable of the workers in the vineyard. When we speak of financial economies, we speak of something called what we might say market value. The price of a used car, for example, depends upon what consumers are willing to pay. And that is, of course, mitigated up and down by supply and demand and competition and all those varied factors in an economy. But when we speak of spiritual economies, we might see ourselves rather through a similar lens. In short, we prefer to kind of balance the books, even spiritually speaking. We think of hard work, of good moral behavior, and these should give us, certainly, is it not true, an advantage against those that we view who don't understand these things and are frankly beneath us. And this is the way that the Pharisees, of course, viewed the world around them. The parable that Jesus tells us in our study today is devoted to seeing God's grace as built upon something that is more than merely being built upon performance and how you're doing. And Jesus is saying that if we view our relationship with him as a kind of contract with obligations on both sides, and that leads us kind of to one of two possible extremities. We may feel entitled to blessing because of our hard work and our obedience. Surely this is going to work out well. That's the way things are supposed to go. That's the deal we got. Or in the other extremity, we may feel angered when when others receive blessings that we feel they don't measure up to and don't really quite deserve because they're not meeting the terms of the contract like we understand it. And so by contrast, Jesus declares that the economy, that spiritual economy of God's kingdom is not going to be ruled by contracts and obligations and that sort of thing, but rather it's going to be defined by love and by grace and these kinds of values. And so the unfair thing about grace, if there's something unfair about grace, it's of course that any of us should receive it at all, that any of us should receive salvation at all. And leads us not to frustration like the servants of the parable, but when we understand that economy of grace, that everything we get, whether it be small or large or whatever it is, it all comes to us as undeserved merit and favor from a God who has sought us, found us, and made us his own. Let's look at the parable in Matthew chapter 20. Let's talk our way through it a little bit, get the foundation of it, and today I want to quickly make 4 points about this parable. Matthew 20, beginning in verse 1, it says this: "For the kingdom of heaven," Jesus taught, "is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard. And he agreed to pay them a denarius for the day and sent them into his vineyard." Now, what you should think of is the idea of day laborers. We see this somewhat even in our own economy. Folks who kind of go to a home place, a Home Depot type of place or something like that, or a building place, and they hope to be hired for the day, and they'll be paid a denarius is the deal that has struck. That's a word in the New Testament language that spoke of kind of what would be your typical day's wage. So they agree, I will hire you. They agree, we will work for you for this day. Now, early in the morning, we should probably understand this is dawn or about 6 o'clock in the morning in the first hour of the day. Now, about 9 in the morning, your translation may have about the third hour, he went out and saw others standing in the marketplace doing nothing. He needed more workers. So he said to them, you go work in my vineyard, and I'll pay you whatever's right. So they probably figured, well, we're going to be there for 9 hours maybe instead of the 12 hours that the others, so we'll probably get that proportionate amount, but it wasn't specifically determined. And so they went. He went out again about noon, and about 3 in the afternoon, and did the same thing. So at noon, halfway through the day, he gets more workers, sends them into the vineyard. 3 hours later, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we're 9 hours now into the day. He finds more workers, sends them into the vineyard. And then about 5 in the afternoon, he went out and still found others standing around. And he asked them, why have you been standing here all day doing nothing? And they said, because no one has hired us. He said to them, you also go and work in my vineyard. Now, possibly it's like the weather systems are going to change in upcoming days. He's been looking at the weather channel the landowner has, and he sees that there's a cold front coming through, and it's going to storm, and he's got to get the work done, and so he's looking for more people, and he's hiring them even for a single hour of the day to get the harvest in. And when the evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, call the workers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last ones hired and going to the first. So they start with the guys who only worked for an hour. those workers who were hired about 5 in the afternoon came, and each received a denarius. Now, what would you say was a denarius? That's what he promised he was going to pay those guys back there at 6 o'clock in the morning. But they only worked 1 hour. They get a day's wage for it. And so when those who came who were hired first, they thought, boy, we are set today. We're going to get a bonus check today. We're going to receive more. But each one of them also received a denarius. And when they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. These who were hired last only worked 1 hour, they said. We're going to call the government on this. No, it didn't say that. And you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden and the work and the heat of the day. But he answered one of them, I'm not being unfair to you, friend. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give the one who was hired last the same I gave to you. I want to do that. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I'm generous? Just because I'm generous and I gave them the same amount, though they worked less, you're envious about that? Take your pay. I've been fair to you, and go. So it says, here's the bookend. The last will be first, and the first will be last. I've never seen anything so unfair in all my born days, said the famous Southern Baptist preacher named W.A. Criswell. Dr. Criswell, pastor of the First Baptist Church of Dallas, a mega church during the years when I was attending Dallas Theological Seminary, church kind of just down the street from where I went to school. He was a famous Southern Baptist preacher and leader of that evangelical movement of the Southern Baptist Convention all over the country and world. And I heard him actually say this and deliver this at the beginning of his sermon about 30 years ago. Not in Dallas, but at the Moody Pastors Conference at Moody Bible Institute. And he started that way, and he started to talk about this parable. This parable of what one person got and another person got, and so on. And I thought to myself, if I did not say to my pastor friend sitting next to me, he's going to preach on this topic to us? He, the big dog dude of the Southern Baptist Convention in Dallas, is going to choose this passage to preach to all of us little people in ministry? You got to be kidding. What's he going to say to us? And W.A. said, as I prepared for this sermon, and I got to do it like he does it. He's Southern Baptist. As I prepared for this sermon, I thought about all the pastors in the little country churches like the one I started 55 years ago. Enough of that. I'll never get done. Back to Jersey talk. Okay, and I thought about my church of 10,000 people, my large salary, the mansion home that my precious people has given to me as the parsonage, the 2 new cars that I bought just last year. Could I give it up and go back to the little country church where I began? To work again in a simple and small place in the vineyard? Could I do it? Could I do it? I don't know. I don't know. And he went through this, and he agonized through this sermon. It was fabulous. And everybody is leaning forward more and more, thinking, where is he going with this thing? And he gets to the end, and he read this poem that he wrote about the struggle that was going on in him in the preparation for these remarks. And every phrase of the poem ended with, and I met God face to face in the Moody Bible place. And of course, a Southern, I can't preach like this, guys. I don't see. I found my red shirt. Southern Baptists, they got white belt, white shoes, and you know what I'm talking about. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. But at the end of the sermon, everybody just cheered at the end. It was just fantastic. One of the greatest sermons I've ever heard, and it got to the heart of what this message is about. But when you look at this parable, And you look at it like an American mind looks at it. A mind that's steeped in labor, fairness, and practices with phrases that go through our equality-oriented fairness minds, equal pay for equal work and things like that. It seems terribly unfair and unjust. But let's unpack it quickly today with me making 4 statements, 3 negatives with a final positive. First thing is to say this: don't look toward rewards for serving God. Don't look for rewards as a reason for serving God. You know, Peter was not far from the truth when he said that we've given up everything for you. I mean, they had really given up a lot. As you know, they just dropped it and walked away and followed Jesus. Pretty much everything was behind them. And Jesus assured him in his response that earlier in the chapter before, that there was great reward for them for serving and so forth. But there was a troubling tone in the question that came from the former fisherman. That the element he heard in there of kind of sounding like he's serving only maybe for what can be gotten, rather than out of a genuine heart's love for the one who had given him the new career as a fisher of men. What was the true nature of his motivation? That was the question that haunted the soul of Criswell that day, Pastor Criswell, in that sermon near the very end of his career in his very aged years. You know, we're troubled by people that we know in culture who only appear to ever be involved in an activity simply because of the great reward that they get from it. To many of you who, like me, are big-time fans of professional sports, it drives us a bit crazy to see some of our favorite players hoping they'll stay with the team when they become a free agent, but rather taking an extra $1 million, as if that makes a difference with all the millions that they already got, to go to some vile place like the New York Yankees or something like that, you know. And it just, you know, when the difference from here to there is more money than most of us would ever make in a lifetime, let alone the expanse of their contract. And we struggle with that, and we're kind of offended by it because there's no purest love for the game, or for the team, or for the fans who supported them. It's only about the reward. Because I look at it, and I'll talk baseball, that's my love, and I mean, I'd give my right arm to be able to play for the Baltimore Orioles. Of course, if I gave my right arm, then I wouldn't be able to play for them, although maybe I could, because they're playing like right now, like all of them only do have one arm, and I'm still waiting. It was 40 years ago. Think about it. It was 40 years ago this last spring. They gave a 1 run on 4 hits over 9 innings, and the Orioles scout said, I'm going to give you a call. I'm still waiting. All my phone's down there. I'll check it later. All right. You know, we're just offended by that there's not a purest love for something. The question does come to us, why do we serve God? Do you serve God? If you serve God, why do you serve God? Why are you here today? Why don't you do something else? What motivated you to come here today? What motivated you today to maybe put something in those baskets that went by early, or to do the online part of it, or to serve, or to be a part of children's ministries whenever you're a part of that, or to do anything that's a part of serving God? Do you do it out of a love for the one who rescued you out of the marketplace of sin and death and gave you a life and gave you membership in an eternal vineyard that never will fade away, an eternal kingdom? Do you do it because you love him, or do you do it because you sort of know somehow that you better do this? You got to do this because you're not sure if you're going to get really the rewards that are right. There's kind of a contract, there's sort of an obligation kind of thing there. Is that why you do it? Because, well, God's going to be obligated to pay me back if I do that. There's a whole branch of the Christian religion out there that practices and preaches this. We call it the prosperity gospel, of course. talks about giving and serving and doing as seeds that you plant so that you can get a rich harvest, yes, for eternity, but you're going to get some rich harvest now and send us a portion of it, of course, you know. God doesn't really work that way, though, does he? He's not into the pay-as-you-play system of things. But that's not without some general elements of truth, though, of course. As it regards God's faithfulness for genuine service and giving and trusting him, there are rewards. The scriptures do speak of that. I believe most of those rewards are ultimately in another place and in another kingdom than this place, where it says in the scriptures that moth and rust and so forth don't cause it to fade away. But they are never to be the reason for what we do. So first thing, don't serve God because of rewards. Don't look in that direction. Second thing, don't look at and compare yourself with others when serving God. Try to get away from comparing yourself to others. The workers in the vineyard did a lot of looking around at the others who kept showing up in the vineyard and helping out. There's a lot of work to be done. And the owner had to keep going out to the marketplace and bringing more people in. And maybe some of the reason he had to keep bringing more people in is because the guys he had were looking around, comparing themselves to everyone else around them and not getting the work done. They're probably there standing there and thinking of the guys who came in at noon and saying, I'm twice as good as them. I'm 4 times better than those guys who showed up at 3 o'clock, and they knew they were 12 times better than the guys who came at 5 o'clock. Man, my compensation package is going to be great today. There's going to be a bonus in it. God, in his wisdom and grace, is on his own schedule and time. And he calls us when he calls us by his sovereign will. And he takes us and he puts us in the place where he wants us. And he tells us to work and to be faithful in that place until such time as he shows and moves us to another place or says the time for work is done. I find it hard not to look around the vineyard. I'll confess that to you. To look around the vineyard near and far. To look around and see what it appears to be harvesting and success that's happening. But I look at those workers and I know that they're not presenting themselves and their theological systems accurately. They're hiding things and marketing themselves in ways that aren't true. I see others who get up front and they're applauded for their excellence and their ability to communicate the scriptures and so on. And folks think, my, what great minds and great talents. But I know, because I know how to see these things and I know where things come from, they've gotten it from some guy on the other side of the country who's famous and has it out there, and they've taken it and they've used it without attribution, and they've gained the glory and credit, and it seems like a tremendous amount of fruit for it, and that drives me crazy. It's so difficult that I find myself struggling, as the Apostle Paul did when he said, it is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. The latter do so out of love, knowing I'm put here for the defense of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing that they can stir up trouble for me while I'm in chains. But what does it matter? That sounds so much like Hillary. I'm sorry. What does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. And because of this, I rejoice. And that's where we need to be, to just rejoice and be kingdom players, to be harvesters, to be workers in God's vineyard, where he puts us, whether we're famous for doing it, well-known, stepped on, overlooked, ignored, whatever. He's a good bookkeeper. It's going to be all right. Yet, truthfully, I will tell you, comparing and looking around, I have this other thing that happens to me when I'm really introspective, and I see some pastor friends of mine that I know who labor in very tiny and very difficult places in the vineyard. One of them, who is a friend of mine, has stayed faithful at the same place for decades, serving there and loving people and rejoicing in God's goodness that he has the opportunity every Sunday to stand up and preach the gospel to honestly what is a congregation full of ingrates who do not appreciate this man of faithfulness and kindness and prayer and truth and ability to be a shepherd. And they worked against him, and they've worked against him for decades, and every Sunday he comes back and loves them some more. I tell you, I would go full Peter on him. Give me the sword, Malchus, off with your ear, if not something closer to the center mass of the human body. That's what I would have done in that place. And he loves them, and he cares for them, and he shepherds them. Another friend of mine works hard in week-long sermon preparation and prayer. And this man has a passion for the lost of the world like I've never seen in anyone else. And he's got this handful of people that come to his church, and that's about all he's had all these years. But he's faithful, and he works hard, and he serves them faithfully. Could I do that? Could I do that? Quote Criswell, I don't know. I don't know. We all have our unique calling, the place in the Lord's vineyard that God has uniquely put us to labor faithfully with a task that's in hand. He's given us different abilities and capacities and gifts. And it's not about being prominent and successful in obvious ways, but it's rather about being faithful to a God in all ways, the one who alone sees and is faithful, and he alone rewards in his own way and in his own time, and we can count on him to be generous across the board. A third thing, don't just look simply at yourself when serving God. Quickly now, this is what the Pharisees and religious leaders did. And though this was not the immediate context that we see in the text here preceding the parable, that this perspective that they were always nearby and always kind of complaining and always kind of criticizing around the disciples, we know that that's a part of the whole context. The Pharisees and religious leaders just knew that they were really in good shape with God. I mean, they just knew they had to be. They worked really, really hard at it all the time, sizing themselves up, taking the commands of scriptures and writing out meticulous applications of what that would mean in real life practice, and then they put them to work, and they told others they should do it, and the others didn't understand it, and they couldn't do it, and they couldn't live up to it. So surely these religious leaders were the best of them all. You know, when we hear the word Pharisee, you call somebody a Pharisee. Tim Lester, you Pharisee. Did I say something nice to you? Not really. But in the Old Testament context, or in the time of Christ, the Pharisees were actually held in high regard. People honored and were amazed by them at their good works and deeds and the meticulous nature. But they knew they were really, really, really in good shape. And in the parable, the morning workers believed themselves to be in good stead also. Seeing payment of the shorter-term laborers, they just knew they were in for an exceptional payday. After all, they were the ones chosen at the beginning. Why were they the ones chosen at the beginning? Well, they were there, first of all, and they were probably the best. They probably had the best guns or whatever. You know what I'm saying? That's why they got chosen in the morning out of the marketplace. How might we be like this? How might we be like these Pharisees or like these early morning workers? We might be people who look at how long we've been in the faith and in the church, how many years we've tithed and we've faithfully served. Those who are gifted to serve in prominent and powerful ways may reflect on all the things that they have done because they've worked so hard and they're so smart and so on. They just know that in measurable ways, and we're into measurements in America, that in measurable ways, they must have success, because look at the numbers and look at the excess and look at the good things and the blessings that have come. God must particularly bless them, and they know people say that, and that's how they see themselves. But Paul tells us and encourages us, as he wrote in Romans 12, by the grace given to me, there we're back to grace, the economy of grace. By the grace given to me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment in accordance with the faith God has distributed to you. We should follow the model of Philippians 2, not just the theology of Philippians 2 about the incarnation of Christ and the great humility of Christ, but to understand that humility is the context of that passage. And all the theology is an illustration of the point that Paul is making, that we need to be humble because what we have is a gift from God. Be it big or be it small, be like Christ. Make my joy complete, he says, by being like-minded, having the same love, being in one spirit and one mind, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourself, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. And then it goes on to talk how Christ humbled himself, not just to come to earth, but to die. Not just to die, but to die on the cross. And it ends up God highly exalted him. Again, God is faithful in the end. And I tell you, as I look back now on 38 years of doing this shepherding thing, I think back over some of my favorite sheep that have been in the places that I've been. And I have to say that those who first come to mind are those who simply walk up from time to time and just say, hey, what do you need done right now? How can I help right now? What do you need done right now? What is it? Anything. Just tell me. I want to help you right now. And I bet you anything on the scriptures that this is exactly how God's attitude is when he looks at us as we serve him. He wants us to be like that, to be quick, to do anything, simply glad to be a sheep in this pen, a sheep of his flock, of his pasture, a worker in his vineyard, be it at the front gate or be it in the dark corner that nobody sees. To be simply glad we're in the vineyard, to have been found, not because we were looking, but to be found when we were just in the marketplace, to be found by the one who came and sought us and called us to himself, the master of masters, and then being called by him to serve him. And he has chosen to place each of us, be it in the pressure-packed public arena of dealing with snipping, snapping, sniping sheep, or in a remote corner picking grapes where no one sees that you're there, and not even that, they don't even know it exists. To be faithful wherever it is, because God put us there, and God will be faithful to us as we're faithful. That's the economy of grace that we're talking about. So be faithful to be his sheep. Be thankful to be his vineyard worker. Be it the place that you're sent, be it in Kazakhstan, be it in Kyrgyzstan, be it in Hagerstan, be it in Charleston, South Carolina-stan, or Idaho-stan, or wherever you're taken. Be faithful. Serve God there. Let the reward with him. Father, that's easy to say and harder to do. Help us to do it. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen.